This SoonerScoop.com video is streaming in crystal clear 4K resolution on YouTube thanks to Enjoy Vision in Oklahoma City. If you're ready to see the rest of the world just as clearly, get your fresh perspective at Enjoy Vision. Enjoy Vision. This is where Sooner Scoop LASIX.
Hello and welcome back. Eddie Radosovich, George Stoya here from the SoonerScoop.com studios. A Tuesday in the BLC. Big game tonight in downtown Oklahoma City.
Massive game.
Game 5.
Biggest game in 9 years.
Very scary about that. I don't know when you'll be watching this, but it was a good time as everything kind of winds down into the offseason. I know that we've seen some of the players already out and about, going back home for a couple weeks before they come back and start working out with Schmitty for the summer. It was a good time to kind of take a step back. What do we know about this Oklahoma football team going into 2025? We're going to start with the offense in this video. We'll do a completely separate video with the defense, kind of going position by position and talking about kind of what we learned, what we maybe didn't know going into the spring that we were surprised about, and everything in between. Before we get to that, though, George, let us tell you about our good friends over at William & Lauren. William & Lauren, as the official custom clothier of OU football, William & Lauren outfits your favorite OU players in custom suits that boost their confidence off the field to match their confidence on the field. Their perfectly tailored clothing ensures every Sooner stands out in comfort and style at prices that make luxury accessible. You can visit William & Lauren in Oklahoma City or in Tulsa now, or online at williamandlauren.com. That is williamandlauren.com. Dress like a champion and make your style as legendary as Oklahoma football. George and Aaron picking out your suit. Was that the suit fitting?
Yes, yeah, that was the suit fitting.
And you picked it up.
I've picked it up, and it looks awesome, amazing.
Very
the
good.
material is awesome, fits perfectly, and they do a really good job too, making sure that when I went in and tried everything on, that everything was exact. So
there's something about getting a custom suit made.
Oh yeah, and having the lining on the inside, and I got to put my name on it and all that stuff. So super cool process.
It's awesome. Visit William & Lauren online, or as we said, you can do it in Oklahoma City, or now you can do it up in the 918 in Tulsa. All right, there's nowhere to start when you're talking about the Oklahoma offense better than kind of the two brand new faces. Obviously, they went through spring football, but Ben Arbuckle and John Mateer. And I think that when you look at the 2024 Oklahoma football season, a lot of the offense had a lot to do with the offense coordinator and everything that came with Seth Luttrell being promoted. Obviously, a lot of people regret that around Norman, as well as quarterback. And, John Mateer, when you bring him in, that was kind of the first shot in the arm that this thing was going to need to coincide with one another. What did you think about Ben Arbuckle? I know that we've talked about him pretty much ad nauseum here over the course of the last couple months since he arrived in Norman. You also could see the interview that you and Joe Castiglione Jr. did when he sat in with us on the family business and kind of getting to know him. But they have a big undertaking here in trying to turn this thing around.
I think the biggest thing with Ben Arbuckle is he puts his players in positions to succeed. And that reminds us of, somebody like a Lincoln Riley that was obviously here for several years and had some of the most prolific offenses college football has seen. I'm not saying Ben Arbuckle is going to do that, but I do think his offensive style, his scheme is very reminiscent of that. And the way that he's had success with the quarterbacks that he's had, whether that's at Western Kentucky or Washington State these last few years, early in his career, all of his quarterbacks have gone on to be very successful. Obviously, Cam Ward just went number 1 in the NFL draft a few weeks ago, and he spent a year with him at Washington State. And, obviously had a huge year last year at Miami. And then you look at John Mateer, who Oklahoma's bringing in, all the accolades he had a year ago, who's considered one of the best quarterbacks in college football last season, the number 1 guy in the transfer portal back in the winter. You feel really good about it, Eddie. I think the question is, how good can they be? Because I think we all agree this thing's going to be better offensively than it was a year ago. That's an extremely low bar. But how good can John Mateer be? How good can Ben Arbuckle be? Is this a top 50 offense, which would be a huge step in the right direction? Right. Considering where this thing was last year. If they were a top 50 offense last year, maybe they win 8 or 9 games, right? Maybe they win 8 or 9 games this year if they're a top 50 offense. But could they be even better? Could they be a top 25 offense? Can John Mateer be a middle-of-the-pack SEC quarterback, which, again, step in the right direction from where they were a year ago? Or is he a top 5 guy? Is he a Heisman contender? Is he in that kind of talk? That, to me, at quarterback and offensive coordinator, and those two guys obviously being the big storyline, that's the biggest question is, okay, It's an upgrade. They feel good about it. They had a great spring. But how good? What level can they get to?
If nothing else, when you're talking about the quarterback position, you're bringing in somebody in John Mateer that certainly has experience, right? He's done it at the Division I level, certainly hasn't done it in the SEC. That's going to be kind of the fun, I guess, portion of the early non-conference, and seeing him go up against a Michigan in week 2 here in Norman. The one thing that you can say about John Mateer that he has brought with him to from Pullman, is the accuracy. And I think that's something that we had talked about throughout the spring. He completed 64.6% of his passes a year ago, just under 3,200 yards, 3,139, 29 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. He's taking care of the ball. And certainly when you add in what he's been able to do with his legs, it makes for a rather interesting subject line when you're talking about the Oklahoma quarterback position.
You mentioned the accuracy, and that's what jumps off the page when you talk about John Mateer as a passer, right? Is he puts the ball in spots that's difficult to do. And I think some of it also is this offense allows receivers to get open, and it kind of schemed them open. And that's something that last year felt like we were every week like, how come no one's just never open, right?
Sure.
Like, and we'll get to the receiver position. It feels like that's obviously going to be a totally new room. Maybe that helps some of that too. But I think the scheme, as well as John Mateer's accuracy, but you mentioned it, the legs, that's the difference maker for John Mateer. What was it, 14 touchdowns last year on the ground? What does that look like in this offense? Does Ben Arbuckle lean on those legs? Does he lean on John Mateer to escape the pocket, have some quarterback run game? That was a big part of the times that Oklahoma was successful last year. It was running the ball with the quarterback. You think back to that Alabama game, Jackson Arnold using his legs, the way that they did that. Does some of that, carry over with Ben Arbuckle? Does he, use that for some of this, this new offensive line and attacking on the ground? You have a new running back in Jaden Odd. Xavier Robinson is back. All of those pieces, I think they're gonna really lean on the run. And I know when you hear air raid offense, you think, oh, they're gonna throw the ball all around the field, and they want to do that. But in Ben Arbuckle's 3 years calling plays, he's actually ran the ball more than he's thrown the ball. So I do think you're going to see John Mateer use his legs quite a bit for Oklahoma.
826 yards and 15 touchdowns on the ground last season. Obviously, that added up to the regular season lead in terms of throughout the country with 44 touchdowns responsible for from John Mateer a year ago. That quarterback room has kind of taken a unique step just under Ben Arbuckle. It looks a lot different than it did a year ago, obviously, without Jackson Arnold. Michael Hawkins Jr. back. You would think he's going to be the the heir apparent or the backup to John Mateer going into 2025. Just as recently as this past week when they added Whit Newbar as well as Jet New, the freshman quarterback. Should be interesting to see kind of how that quarterback room balances out. Obviously, they talked about it throughout the spring, though. You have a guy in John Mateer that has run this offense going alongside Ben Arbuckle. It's been a big deal that those guys have been on the same page, kind of preaching the offense or teaching the offense to the new guys.
Yeah, I think that having both them at the same time, being able to kind of, take guys step by step this spring and learning the offense has been huge. But you look at that quarterback room as a whole, and I really like it. Michael Hawkins showed flashes last year. We saw it in the bowl game against Navy. We obviously saw it against Auburn in his first career start. Had a rough game against Texas and South Carolina. That's going to happen when you get thrown into that kind of situation as a true freshman. But, when you hear Ben Arbuckle talk about Michael Hawkins and his potential, well, John Mateer is the lead guy. He's the leader in that locker room. He is QB1. I think the future for Michael Hawkins is extremely bright. And I wonder, with his dynamic ability with his legs, does Michael Hawkins have a package? Do they play him a little bit this year? And then, what does Whit Newbauer do? Does he play at all? I mean, 6'6", 225 pounds. That's a big dude at quarterback. Played well at Mercer last year as a freshman. So we'll see. But I think that Oklahoma feels pretty good about its quarterback room as a whole.
Sometimes a year ago, it felt like the best option just to carry the football out of the backfield was just snapping the ball to the quarterback, right?
Yeah.
And that certainly changed as we got to the end of the season. Xavier Robinson started to pop off for DeMarco Murray. And then the big addition here in the spring portal, if you had John Mateer in the fall portal, it was Jaden Ott, and the addition of him coming from Cal, a guy that Jim Nagy had, obviously identified early before he even got it into the portal. We had talked about, kind of his, I guess, just overnight, basically going from Cal running back's room to Oklahoma's running back room. The running back room and DeMarco Murray's situation as a whole seems rather interesting. Gavin Sawchuk transfers out. You have Javonte Barnes coming back, as well as Xavier Robinson. Taylor Tatum still waiting in the wings, number one running back in the high school ranks from a year ago, coming off of kind of an up and down freshman season, and then obviously adding in a true freshman in Torrey Blaylock this spring.
Look, I think from top to bottom, this is maybe the most talented, highest ceiling group that DeMarco Murray's had since his time in Norman. When you talk about the playmaking ability of a guy like Jaden Ott, he is somebody that Oklahoma has been missing in this offense. And last year you saw it. They just did not have a dynamic playmaker at running back until late in the season when Xavier Robinson got into the game. And that's kind of my biggest question mark with this group, Eddie. What's the rotation? Because while you firmly believe that Jaden Ott should be the starter, will he be? Like, I feel like that's been a question with DeMarco's room ever since he got here is who's he going to play today, right? And why aren't some guys playing over other guys? Last year when Xavier came in, it's like, where's this guy been all season? And I get it, he's a true freshman. It takes time and all of that kind of stuff, but I think that there's rightfully been some criticism of DeMarco Murray. When you look at the talent that he's been able to bring in, these are guys that are highly recruited, but for some reason they haven't been performing at a high level. Gavin Sawchuk, I think, had dealt with a lot of injuries, and that was part of the issue. Javonte Barnes obviously has had a lingering foot issue now for a couple years. But now you look at that room, you have Jaden Ott, who I know is coming off an injury, but if he can be healthy, he's your best guy. And then you've got Xavier Robinson and Taylor Tatum, two guys that I think have a ton of ability. What do their roles look like? Torrey Blaylock, who apparently had a great spring. What's his role? And then even Javonte Barnes. Like, I feel like we know what Javonte is. He was playing pretty good football last year until he got hurt again. You forget how good he was against Ole Miss, as well as how he was good against Maine. So they've got a lot of different guys in this running back room that can play for DeMarco Murray. It's just, what is that rotation actually going to look like?
Really excited, just like everybody else around these parts that is excited to see Jaden Ott get out onto the field. Obviously, that's not going to happen until the beginning of August. With him coming in,
have you seen any
summer.
of the? I don't know if you follow him on Instagram, but he's been posting some of his workout videos.
No, I haven't seen it.
Boy,
it looks good.
He looks impressive.
Okay.
Yes, I can understand look. It's a lofty comparison, but he is like a smaller Joe Mixon.
Yeah.
Like in terms of his build and the way that he plays the game.
And I think we saw that a little bit in some of the cut-ups that we went through right when he committed to Oklahoma, right? When he was coming in from Cal, some of the stuff that he did as a junior, catching the ball out of the backfield, which you would think is going to be very comfortable for Ben Arbuckle to try to get him the ball in space.
Definitely. And that's something that Oklahoma just hasn't really had at running back since Eric Gray, really. And I think Jaden Ott's a better player than Eric Gray. I think he's a better NFL prospect than Eric Gray. So I think you're gonna see them find ways to get him the ball and in different sorts of options, whether that's screen passes or wheel routes, things like that. I think you're gonna see him get the ball in different ways. And again, I think Jaden's your starter. How many carries does he get in the game? And then what's the role of Xavier Robinson and Taylor Tatum and Javonte Barnes? Because I think those three guys can be contributors next year for Oklahoma. Just how much will you see of them?
Yeah, and it should be a pretty comfortable, at least getting his feet wet a year ago and talking about a guy like Xavier Robinson, as you see on the screen now. He popped off at the end of last year, obviously. 49 carries, 7 games played, 49 carries, 233 yards. It felt like a little bit more than that just because the Oklahoma run game was so absent throughout the season. None of that's going to matter, though, from when you're talking about a backfield that returns guys that have some talent if you don't get any help from the wide receiver unit. And I think that's kind of leads into maybe, for me, one of the bigger question marks on the team, just in terms of you don't know who's going to be that guy. And I go back all the way to the beginning of the spring when, I think a lot of us thought that Jaden Gibson was going to be on the outs. He was going to enter the transfer portal. That obviously didn't happen. It's going to be interesting to get just an update on where he is from a physical standpoint, obviously coming off of the knee injury that ended his season before it began a year ago. You have Giovanni Gibson also on the IR right now. I swear to God, it's not going to be like last year. We don't think. But you do start the summer with some guys that are injured. Giovanni Gibson obviously popped when he began spring football, unfortunately getting hurt in the final week of practice there before the Crimson Combine. but you do have some guys that have experience. You brought in a host of guys in terms of, an Isaiah Satania, Keontez Lewis that have played Division I football before. And then obviously, you talk about that freshman group, whether it be Emmanuel Choice or the guy that had certainly created a lot of headlines for himself in Elijah Thomas.
Look, it's a fascinating room, maybe the most interesting group on the roster, because you look back at last year and all the things that went wrong for Oklahoma. One of the biggest was the injury situation at wide receiver. It felt like they had, their top 5 guys out every single week. And so you look at that room, you lose 6 guys in the transfer portal at wide receiver. You bring in 7 new guys, 2 true freshmen, like you mentioned, in 5 transfers. And it's clear that they were looking for certain things in the portal at this position, production and size. And they were able to go get quite a few of those guys that fit that mold. And so who's going to step up? Because it feels like, look, you only really need, 2 or 3 or 4 guys to be your main receivers. And then you need some backups. Last year we saw they just didn't have the depth, right? Yeah. They had to throw a bunch of true freshmen out there. I think that they feel a lot better about their depth this year. They just don't know who's going to be the guy to stand out. You mentioned the 2 Gibsons. That's a big question for me, because if they can get one of those 2 guys to be healthy next year, and I lean toward it being Giovanni just because, his a broken leg, it's a little easier to recover from. Brent Venables said that they hope to have him back by the start of the season. Like and the way that he played in the spring, it feels like he could be a big time contributor. But we saw what Jaden Gibson could do too. At the end of his 2023 season, he was a big time playmaker. So if they can get one of those guys, or a Jermichael Carter who they got in the spring,
I was going to added Jermichael Carter,
yep.
And a little bit like Giovanni Gibson, that depending on who you talk to around town, it feels like they found a little bit of a diamond in the rough, a guy that certainly has the physicality and the heights and the weight to be able to produce at the SEC level. It's going to just be a question mark. Can you actually do it?
Yeah, and in 9 games last year at McNeese, and I get it, it's at McNeese, 37 receptions, 537 yards, 3 touchdowns. He was a really solid player. Can he carry that over to the SEC? I feel like that's kind of the question mark for every new guy, right? Other than Isaiah Satania, who really I don't think we've talked enough about this offseason. He's been really good, in the spring, and somebody that did produce for Arkansas, so he's played at this level. But I think that's a huge question mark. And then Deion Burks,
right.
The one guy that's coming back from not the one guy, but the guy that everybody thought last year was going to be the dude for Oklahoma. He's back. Can he, replicate what he did at Purdue a couple years ago and be the guy that we all anticipate he can be, which is, a future NFL type receiver?
Burke's season a year ago obviously cut short because of injury. He tried to come back in that Missouri game. It was, I think, a kind of one of those situations that it was like an update every week. Is Deion Burks practicing? Is he going to play? But, I think that when we saw him out at the spring, and then obviously, when you see instances and flashes of what he was able to do a year ago in catching the 4 touchdowns in the Temple opener, sky's the limit. It feels like he's one of those guys, when you're talking about it on the offensive side of the football, George, that they have an NFL type wide receiver in Deion Burks. Can John Mateer get him the ball, and how is Ben Arbuckle going to use him?
Well, and we saw, last year, if you watched Washington State, Kyle Williams, who ended up getting drafted a couple weeks ago, from Washington State, they found all different types of ways to get him the ball, whether it was throwing some deep balls down the field, over the middle, screen passes, handing him the ball. I anticipate that's what Deion Burks is going to look like in this offense. They're going to find unique ways to get him the football in space and let him make big plays. It felt like last year, sometimes they maybe forced it a little too much. They didn't use his ability to really beat guys down the field on some big crossing routes and things like that. And then, of course, he got hurt and was just really never the same player the rest of the season. It sounds like he's finally starting to feel healthy this spring, really turned it on late in spring practice, and found a connection with John Mateer, worked with him a lot after practice. So I expect him to have a big year, Eddie. I think he's going to be Oklahoma's leading wide receiver. We'll see, though. There's just so many new guys in that room. Maybe an Isaiah Satania stands out, who we heard had a great spring. Giovanni Gibson, what's he look like coming back from injury? Elijah Thomas. I mean, that's the guy, that maybe has the highest ceiling of anybody in that wide receiver room. But what can he do as a true freshman? It's so hard to get on the field as a young guy, early in your career, but he certainly has the talent and the tools to be a good player.
Unfortunately, we don't have to remind Oklahoma fans about the situation on the offensive line. How many games did we watch? How many games did we sit in front of the camera on the instant reaction and say, well, they gave up 7 sacks today. They gave up 8 sacks here. They gave up 9 sacks here. Seems like that was basically Oklahoma's second half in Oxford, was just giving up a sack to that outstanding Mississippi offensive line. We leave the spring, though, and I think that you feel pretty good about this offensive line group. Obviously, Heath Ozida and Logan Howland were not able to practice during the spring, sitting out with shoulder injuries, or I guess post-surgery after some cleanups at the end of the season. You go out and you get Luke Baklenko, Derek Simmons, Jake Mikailu from the spring portal, and then obviously Luke Baklenko and Derek Simmons went through spring ball with Oklahoma after committing out of the fall portal. The offensive line class that Bill Beatenbow brought in, the fivesome that is going to be talked about and connected for the rest of their lives because it is such a fantastic group on paper. Michael Fasusi and Ryan Foje leading that group. Where are we at on this offensive line going into the season?
Well, the depth is much better than it was a year ago. You look at the guys they've got coming back. They bring back 5 guys who made multiple starts last year. Jacob Sexton, Logan Howland, Heath Ozida, Febechi Wiwu, and Troy Everett all back. And somebody might be like, well, they weren't very good last year on the offensive line. That doesn't mean anything. But that experience matters. And, you think back to last year, especially the back half of the season, Logan Howland was playing good football. Heath Ozida, good football. Troy Everett, that offensive line got better when he got in the game. Febechi Wiwu, you know what you're getting from the guy. And then you add in the guys they've brought in. I think Derek Simmons was a really strong pickup from Western Carolina. Is he going to be, a future All-Pro? No, but I think he can be a really solid player for you at right tackle. And then the true freshman, Eddie, that's the biggest storyline. How quickly can these guys get on the field? Can Michael Fasusi and Ryan Foje make a serious impact next year? Because we all know these are the most talented guys OU has brought in. You see Michael Fasusi going through here. He is a specimen on the offensive line. Can he pick it up fast enough? Is he physically ready to play in the SEC? That, to me, is the biggest question. I don't think he's going to start week 1 for Oklahoma, Eddie, but I do think by the end of the season, you're going to see quite a bit of Michael Fasusi because he's just too good to not be on the field. And look, he's going to make freshman mistakes. That's going to happen, but I think you live by it and you let the kid learn and grow and develop because I think he's going to be a monster.
They also have the 2 Jakes. Jacob Sexton coming off of an injury a year ago, and Jake Taylor, who it seems like was another one of those guys that I don't know if it ended up just being a quote-unquote culture win, but somebody that we thought, okay, maybe he looks around at the portal during the spring after going through spring ball. Certainly didn't lose those guys. It's not a bad thing to bring guys with experience back to an offensive line that's just trying to build depth overall.
Well, and we forget, too, early in the season, Jake Taylor was the missing piece.
Sure.
Like, that was the piece every week. It's like, well, if they could get Jake Taylor, maybe this offensive line can be something, and he was dealing with an issue that, an injury problem that I think was just, he was going to have to fight through it, and it was just something that he couldn't overcome last year. But I think that he's still a solid player, and if he's your guy that's your backup right tackle, it's not a bad option to have. I think he could even be your starter next year. We'll see how that competition shakes out. And Jacob Sexton, the injuries that he's had, I think, have just been, terrible for him because it's really stunted his development. Like, he was somebody that I think a lot of people thought, when he started that, I think it was the Florida State game a few years ago in the bowl game as a true freshman.
Kind of got thrown in there, if I remember correctly.
Tore his ACL, I think, on like the first play.
It was the first series. I think it was like the 3rd play, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was somebody that everybody was like, he's going to be the starting left tackle of the future. He replaces Tyler Guyton, I think it was, in 2023, late in the season at right tackle. Starts this season at left tackle. He's moved all over the field. Where does he fit into the equation? Because it does feel like almost all 5 spots are up for grabs. Maybe not center. I think Troy Everett probably start there. Jake Mikailu, I think, is going to compete there. But where does Jacob Sexton fit in? Is he a guard? Is he a tackle? He's playing left tackle in the spring, but he's a big question mark. What does he look like this year?
We talk about the running back position, and it's kind of fun to prognosticate and go, okay, I think Jaden Ott could fit in here. Xavier Robinson could fit in here. You have good options, right? And it feels good about talking about it. Same with wide receiver a little bit with all the host of guys that just there's a little bit of unknown. You want to talk about a position that is super unknown, and this is the portion of the program that a lot of people will turn off, I'm sure, because we're talking about the tight end position and Joe John Finley's group. I have no idea I have no idea what to expect. I know that they were pretty high on Will Huggins coming in and making waves here during his first spring. Jaron Canick moves over across the side of the ball to tight end to try his hand on the offensive side, coming over from linebacker. But George, what do we got here when we're talking about a tight end room that has a big old question mark over it?
Yeah, look, there's been a lot of criticism of Joe John Finley this offseason, and rightfully so. That was a tight end room that wasn't very good a year ago. Obviously, Bauer Sharp leaves and Devon Mitchell leaves in the transfer portal. And then you look at the additions and you understand why fans aren't really inspired by what they brought in. Now, that doesn't mean that Will Huggins or Carson can't be, contributors, next season. But are they going to be, John Mackey winners? Probably not, right? Are they going to be huge difference makers in the offense? I'm guessing not. I'm really interested to see how does Ben Arbuckle use the tight end position, because he did use it a little bit at Washington State, but he's also one of those coordinators that understands his personnel, doesn't want to put them in positions to fail. And I think when you look at that room, I just don't see a ton of difference makers. I think the quote unquote X factor or wild card, whatever you want to call it, is Jaron Canick. What does he look like out there playing tight end, moving from linebacker? He was a really good offensive player back in high school at Hayes. Can he bring that over, to the offensive side of the ball? It's a really tough move. Sounds like he did pretty well in the spring, but what does that look like come SEC play? Is he somebody that can actually be a difference maker? I have no idea.
In closing and talking about the offense, I guess we'll kind of end it here just in terms of what is a success this season for Oklahoma offensively, because I think that, as you said, the bar is extremely low coming off of 2024 when you had an offense that simply was one of the worst that Oklahoma put on a football field in the modern era of the program. The bar's low, but the expectations are still extremely high.
Yeah, look, I think that a lot of people will want to put it into categories and say, hey, they've got to be a top 25 offense. They've got to throw for this many yards. They got to score this many touchdowns. And, I think that's right. Like, they need to be in some of those categories. To me, though, Eddie, just be functional. Go out there, and when the game's on the line too, you feel confident that they can go down and get you in position to score points. Or
maybe even just sit on the football.
Yeah,
and
not have the clock out.
Not have to put your defense back out there, i.e. Columbia.
Exactly, because they're going to play a lot of close games again this year. There's going to be a lot of one-score football games, and we've seen Brent Venables' teams have not fared well in those games. But if you feel confident about your offense going out there in a late game and needing to go down the field to score a touchdown, or like you said, run the clock out, just feel confident in that. Score 28 to 35 points a game, and I think you're going to win some football games, because we'll get to the defense in another video, but I think that side of the ball is going to be pretty damn good again next year. So if this offense can be in that top 30 range, I think they've got a really good chance to win a lot of football games. And so that to me is like, I understand the stats, those will come, but just be functional. Don't turn the ball over. I mean, how many times last year, Eddie, did they just have back-breaking turnovers in big moments?
It seemed like every loss had at least an instance before it maybe turned into a blowout, whether it be the Texas game, whether it be South Carolina, whether it be Tennessee. I mean, you go down the list.
Even
every
Tulane,
one of those games.
Tulane, they end up winning that game because R. Mason Thomas is amazing. But you throw a pick six. Like, it's those moments, that don't always show up in the box score in terms of, they threw for a ton of yards, they scored a ton of points. That stuff will come. Just show us that you can be functional in big moments and in close games.
Ben Arbuckle, you got your work cut out for you, changing the Oklahoma offense, and John Mateer, you're kind of, I guess, combined with it. Everybody's responsible in some sort of way, but should be interesting. It feels like, kind of like everything around the program right now. It does feel like you come out of the spring, and I think rightfully so, you feel positive about it.
Yep.
You feel confident about it, but I think a lot of the stuff on the offensive side of the ball, as we'll talk about over the next couple months before the start of the season in August or before the start of camp, they're going to have to be able to do it on Saturdays.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
It really doesn't matter what a lot of people are going to talk about over the next couple months. You got to be able to go out and do it during the season.
Yeah, and it's not going to be easy, right? We've all talked about it. The schedule is just brutal, but Oklahoma has tremendous opportunity in front of them, and I credit Brent Venables and the administration. They went out and got two of the best guys in Ben Arbuckle and John Mateer. I mean, I don't know if they could have done a better job in hiring Ben Arbuckle and John Mateer. And, it looks great on paper, but like you said, now you got to go prove it on Saturdays in the fall.
It's a little bit of a spring recap on the offensive side of the football. He's George Stoya. I'm Eddie Radosevich. We'll see you next time on the SoonerScoop.com YouTube channel.